Hey everyone, it's A.B. Stoddard at the Bulwark. I'm back with my friend Bill Kristol, co-author of Morning Shots and editor-at-large at the Bulwark. Bill, I'm in my country over party shirt trying to stay sanguine, but we're getting really close. And we have James Carville this morning saying it's Harris and Nate Silver saying it's Trump. Nate Silver is advising that no one should take what he's saying because it's just a hunch. But he looks at voting patterns. He looks at polls that have been steady since Biden was the candidate, all the way up till now at the last minute. So that makes me nervous. Let's just start with what you're feeling, and then we're going to talk about the last couple days.
I don't know. It's extremely, it seems to be close. It could go either way. I guess I'm slightly optimistic about Harris. I don't really know why, but I think the Trump comeback has been a little oversold, and there's not that much evidence of it in the polls. The early voting stuff is very hard to read. So I don't know. There are these two clumps of undecided voters, I think. The kind of swingish voters, Republicanish types. They're presumably, hopefully being affected by Liz Cheney and John Kelly. And then there are the voters who just haven't been tuned in much, and there's a dispute about how to get to them best. But I think, personally, they've got to be alarmed about Trump and his recklessness and how risky a pick he would be for them. And I wonder if John Kelly helps with them too. I mean, so I guess I'm deciding to be slightly optimistic.
Let's talk about that. There's sort of a debate going on about who that voter is and how they should be targeted. And so Jonathan Martin of Politico had a column about Liz Cheney's appearance with Vice President Harris that was moderated. The first of three was moderated by our publisher, Sarah Longwell. And Jonathan specifically went to a question that the vice president took later in the day from the same fireside chat, this time hosted by Charlie Sykes, where she got a softball about why a conservative who's never voted for a Democrat in their life should vote for her.
Why should they cross over party lines and vote for you?
Well, I start from the belief, based on a lived experience, that the vast majority of us have more in common than what separates us. I also know that you all are here spending time that you could be spending doing a number of other things with all of the obligations you each have. And you are here because we together love our country. We love our country. And we believe in the foundational principles that are at stake in this election.
And Martin made the case that she didn't answer it well, that she said, oh, in my lived experience, we have more in common that separates us, but that she is not speaking to that Republican or right-leaning voter who's still convinced that she's going to be a radical liberal, and that Trump is speaking to that undecided voter, making the case that they should be scared that she will be. So the debate back and forth is the Cheney appearance, is that going to persuade anyone if they're already persuaded and they're already anti-Trump Harris voters? Or is there an undecided right-leaning voter that Cheney can convince and Harris can convince with her that is going to be able to be convinced off of Trump into voting for Harris? Or do they need reassurance that she's not a radical liberal? So, right. So it's this discussion and this difference about how she's making the case to Republicans and right-leaning undecideds. What are your thoughts on that? I think she's doing a good job. I think Cheney is persuasive. We can get to John Kelly in a second, but do you think that she needs to run around directly and saying to people explicitly, I am not a radical liberal. I am going to, govern from the center? Do you think that she needs to be more specific about that?
I mean, she has said the governing from the center, reaching across the aisle stuff. It was very noticeable. I was with her in Pennsylvania at that event at Washington Crossing, and very noticeable, I think, in the conversations with Sarah and Charlie Sykes. So, but I think at this point, less than 2 weeks out, if people, she's not going to get many right-leaning voters. She doesn't need right-leaning voters. There's an anti-MAGA majority in this country. There was in 2016, there was in 2018, there was in 2020. The sort of was in 2022, given that it was an off-year election with bad inflation. And she needs just to get all of them to vote for her. Now, some of them are a little bit, they're not all progressives. I mean, some of them are centrist. Some are right-leaning on individual issues. But I think it's a fantasy that if she says the word centrism a lot, or says I'm not a radical 10 times, or has a more, I don't know what, conservative plan on tax credits or something, they're going to say, oh, okay, she's not a radical. If they want to believe she's a radical, they believe she's a radical.
Yeah.
At this point. She needs to change. So the way to get those voters back is not to sort of play on Trump's turf, I would say, at this point. Maybe 8 weeks ago, she should have answered concerns about immigration and economic policy and transgender and so forth more aggressively. I mean, I don't know. That's a tough call, I think. But now she needs to discredit Trump. She needs to get voters to say, you know what, she probably is a little radical on some of this economic stuff. I don't like the transgender stuff, but we can't have Trump. That's what she's going to win. She's not going to convince people in the last 13 days of this campaign that, maybe she's right on transgender. Maybe we should be paying for the prisoners stuff. If that stuff's already, that ship has sailed. So I have kind of the opposite view, actually, of Jonathan, who's a good friend, and of others who were sort of who've been saying she needs to, still blunt the economic issues. She needs to convince people she has a better tax or healthcare program than that. I kind of feel like that stuff's already baked. I have the opposite view. They say January 6th, the threat of dictatorship, the personal recklessness, disrespecting the military, all that stuff's baked in, and the movable votes can be gotten by the economic sort of arguments. I have the opposite view. I think the other stuff's all baked in, and the movable votes can be gotten by reminding people of how reckless and irresponsible Trump would be in his second term as president.
It's interesting. Trump is playing on her turf. I mean, his closing message plays into her closing message, right? He's acting like a lunatic and threatening an autocracy where he is going to exact retribution on his enemies using the military. And her message is the same. Listen to him. These are his words. This is what he's saying. Talk about John Kelly. You wrote about this morning, a very interesting perspective. I thought what you provided in Morning Shots this morning, because we've heard from John Kelly before. We know it didn't move the needle enough before. John Kelly became frustrated when he went on the record about Trump, more than a year ago or whenever that was, that it didn't move the needle. So when people were saying, why don't you come out and talk more? He actually is on the record saying, I spoke about this before and it didn't budge. There is new data that shows that someone like John Kelly saying something like he said actually would. So talk about why you think it is a little late, but why it can be so effective.
I love John. I know John Kelly some, and he's a very impressive man. He doesn't know that much about electoral politics. He doesn't know what needle was moved by what he said. He's disappointed because somehow Trump didn't collapse when he gave an interview to The Atlantic and said Trump is really irresponsible and praises Nazi generals and stuff. Well, we don't know what's moving. We don't know if the needle might have moved. Well, there was no needle to move. I mean, there was no general election candidate at that point, and Biden was still the candidate, which had its own set of problems. It didn't move, I suppose, the needle in the Republican primary. But again, he didn't try very hard to move the needle. So I just think a ton of people, I'm now getting, as you can tell from my tone of voice, a little exasperated by all these people who've decided based on what? That they know what voters reacted to and didn't. I mean, there's some evidence, of course, from polling and from, focus groups and from, looking at what happens over time, of which arguments work better. But I mean, if I just make a point, why did Joe Biden win in 2020? Not because his economic plan was so wonderful.
Yeah.
Not because of anything, honestly, positive in my view that he said, but because he seemed moderately centrist and because he correctly said that we can't afford another 4 years of Trump. So I think there's a whole fantasy world of which is Democrats and some of the media about, the Democrats, if only they could sort of frame their argument a little better, they would win. Maybe that's true, but maybe that's a 2 or 3 year project or a 10-year project. And meanwhile, they've got to discredit Trump. So we don't know. I wish Kelly would do a press conference. I wish Kelly would film ads. We have an audio, at least, of him saying what he said. It's getting a lot of pickup. I think it's important 2 weeks out. And there is this Blueprint, this Democratic polling and messaging firm, which tested a whole bunch of messages. Abortion rights and Social Security were the two best, let's call them normal Democratic messages. But the best one actually was testing Republicans and people who served with Trump, saying he's unfit for office. And what's striking is that tested very well in terms of moving voters. And I mean, these tests are problematic in certain ways, but they probably capture something. But simply the assertion that Trump is unfit in January and launched a riot on the Capitol and so forth didn't move voters. So I think the messenger matters. And I think Cheney and Kelly are good messengers. Bush and Romney would be good messengers. Mattis and McMaster would be good messengers. The more the better. Quantity probably matters too. Voters don't distinguish each of these people, but if they have a sense that, geez, everyone who worked with him isn't for him, John Bolton, I think that matters. So I'm on the side of the messengers matter. And I think there is some data from Blueprint that suggests that, and that the message that matters has got to be Trump's fundamental unfitness for office. Biden's been president for 4 years. People are going to like or not like his economic plan. Kamala Harris can't just turn this. So, there's a lot of childishness out there. She can just turn the page. Well, yes, sort of. And she has done a pretty good job of that. She's certainly different from Biden. But at the end of the day, she's the vice president in the Biden administration, So if people are really unhappy about the economic, maybe they're unjustly unhappy, but if they're really unhappy with Biden-Harris economic performance, a little hard to fix that 2 weeks out. I think she's blunted that critique some, but now she's got to go on the offensive, I think. So I guess that's where I am. I think, look, she has a big disadvantage. She's Ron Brownstein made this point to me yesterday. We filmed this conversation that will be up later today. Presidents who were unpopular have their successors, sometimes it was their vice president, have not done well in the next election. You know what I mean? It's a big burden to be running as the successor or heir to a president who's not popular, who's not been viewed as a success, and that is basically what Harris has to do, which is why I think ultimately she's done a good job of being more attractive than Biden, getting her personal favorables up and so forth. A little bit of a new page. There's only different person than Biden or Trump, different generation, but ultimately she needs to now discredit Trump.
So, Bill, you and I have talked about these ads, that people are seeing about her support for transgender surgeries while they're watching football, this kind of thing. I found it interesting that in Edward Isaac DeVere's reporting out at CNN, he writes, most of the up for grabs voters are not paying attention to those ads if they're watching TV at all. And this is Democratic aides have told him this. The campaign believes it has the edge over Trump's operation thanks to months of precinct by precinct organizing and planning that is constantly being adjusted based on early vote and online data. So there is an argument, right, that about whether or not she can, like you said, move more policy sentiment in the last 2 weeks. I think it's interesting that they seem to have really invested in the messaging, testing the messaging, and that they've arrived at this message on Trump. It's been thought through, and it has David Plouffe at the helm, being very scientific about it. Another thing I thought was interesting is they are not relying, same reporting from CNN, on such silent majority voters coming over to the vice president, that they believe that they're trying to basically cut paths to victory without depending on this kind of silent surprise Republican vote. And Plouffe says, I'm confident that we're being conservative in how we view this race so that we are more likely to be surprised on the upside of things. So that's just interesting about tactics and mechanics that I thought was heartening. There's another one quoted in here, but not by name, saying, I think this entire thing will be decided in the last week. In fact, I'm sure of it. So it is not too late for John Kelly. What are other things you think that they can do? What are other things you think that Harris should be doing? We know she's going to Texas on Friday. Texas is a red state, but there is a very close Senate race there now. Ted Cruz has survived in 2018 by 2.6 percentage points to Beto O'Rourke, and is now in a way too close Senate race against Colin Allred, who's a really great candidate. And the vice president's going to go and appear with Congressman Allred to try to give him a bump and talk about abortion there, which is a great place to talk about it. What other things do you think that she should be doing with the time she has left?
I think she has to close on two issues, Trump and Dobbs, abortion rights. That's why she's going to Texas. And I think she's very wide. Texas is the place that has the most horror stories, sadly, about maternal health, about people attempts to really intrusive government attempts to monitor people's travel, apparently, and it's a good place to highlight that. And again, people are very much I feel like an awful lot of younger reporters, people much younger than us, are like, oh, if you go to a swing state, then you speak only to those people in that swing state. People in Wisconsin and Michigan will see the news of her in Texas. Yeah. The internet, social media, news channels, they're kind of national, right? And so this idea that, you only, now, of course, if you go, you get a little more local news if you go to Pennsylvania and you do your event there. But this has become a little mythologized, the whole swing state thing. I think it's wise of her to go to Texas because it highlights the issue. Do you want this country to have abortion laws like Texas's? And you can't really highlight that as well in Michigan and Pennsylvania because they have Democratic governors and they have liberal abortion laws. And it's a little complicated to explain the threat nationally. It's easier just to go to Texas. So I'm very much for her doing that, just as I think, incidentally, Trump is smart to go to Madison Square Garden. It's a nationally known place, and he's going to make his kind of working class, wrestling / hockey / basketball appeal, man of the people, sports against these, liberal elites who would never set foot in, the 20,000 in a crowd of 20,000 screaming fans at Madison Square Garden. And he's from New York, and he probably has a special thing about the garden and stuff. But so again, I think I'm a little, incidentally, I have a high regard for Pluff, but I'm a little worried that they're so now driven by the data. But what is the data? It's some poll that says that people really like a certain proposal. So one of the proposals that's tested the best, apparently, in polling is helping the sandwich generation with tax credits or other kinds of ways, letting them go use Medicare instead of Medicaid money to pay for senior care for their parents, at home care. And it is a big burden on people, and it's probably a good proposal. And people say, I like that proposal. But that's very different from saying, I'm therefore going to vote for someone who talks about that proposal as opposed to someone else who doesn't. First of all, Trump hasn't really been against it. He just doesn't talk about it. Secondly, people have a very high discount rate of doubting that any of these things will actually be passed into law, so they don't really think Harris is going to do it necessarily. So I think there's a kind of simplistic view of politics sometimes that, you just find the things that are most popular and talk about them, as if the other side isn't talking about a million things as well. And as if it might be that you move voters not on the thing you're most popular on, but on the thing where you have the best comparative advantage on, or where you can make a credible argument to voters. And so this is where I come back to Trump. The big advantage of Dobbs and Trump as closing arguments is they're actually true and important and fundamental, and they reflect actual reality of what happened in the last several years. Promising a better senior care I literally can't think of a single. Maybe a few voters will say, "Oh, that's great. I wasn't going to vote for Harris." Kind of a Trumpy person, but I think she says she's going to help me take care of my mom, so I'll switch her. Maybe. I'm pretty dubious at this point that people are switching on that. So I'm not against running on that stuff, and of course they've advertised a ton on that.
But I'm told that Donald Trump, the 45th and soon to be 47th president, is going to eliminate taxes on tips, taxes on overtime, taxes on Social Security benefits, and he's going to eliminate the income tax for firefighters and cops. So I don't know. This is supposed to work. Okay.
Yeah, but no one takes that. He's not. No one thinks he's going to do that. That's not a real. That's a cultural signaling proposal. That's not a policy proposal. Yeah. So this again, I think the policy types in the Democratic Party are a little. I do worry that they're fighting a 1988 policy election or something, and that is not what it's about.
Okay, Bill thinks the voters are savvier than me. I was in line in Atlanta on Friday morning, and a woman handed me her no taxes on tips, a little business card that said no taxes on tips, vote Trump. And she obviously is handing it to every waitress and every hair cutter and every service person. So I actually think that stuff works more on the people than you do. I think you think they're skeptical. I think they buy into a lot of it. Anyway, Bill, so let's end on a positive note. In addition to what they're doing with the data over at the Harris campaign, they have a lot of money and they're pretty smart about the ground game. They've done this before. They've done it with Obama. They were preparing it with Biden. Trump has farmed out his ground game to Elon Musk and Charlie Kirk. So there might be some money there, but there's not the same experience that Democrats are working with in terms of the mechanics of getting people out to vote, watching the early vote, and then trying to find the people they need to get out once they see the returns for the early vote, that type of thing. And I just wonder, are Harris voters more motivated? I mean, I look at, the close and I think if it's a 50-50 race, which coalition is going to be more motivated? And I actually think it's the Harris coalition. Sure, she is the incumbent, the quasi-incumbent. Sure, Biden's unpopular. People are really angry about inflation and immigration, and the wrong track numbers are bad. And we could sit here and focus on that. But Trump's supporters, they love him, but not all of them are frothing at the mouth. His new converts, right? They're young men. Are they going to get out? So I kind of wonder, if you look at the ground game and you look at what people are motivated by, I just feel like those two things together, the energy plus the operation, might be able to bring it home for her. And Carville talked a little bit about that in the piece he wrote today in the Times. What do you think?
I defer to Carville on this, and I think it sounds right what you're saying. I've always been a skeptic about the ground game stuff. My personal view has been in campaigns, generally the messaging defeats the organization. But obviously if it's 50-50, it gets you half a point or a point. It can be extremely useful. And I do sort of agree with you that, well, I don't know. I just don't know how motivated are these Trump voters. There's some evidence in some of the early voting that their, rural voters are just turning out in unprecedented numbers. On the other hand, maybe they're just voting early this time as Trump told them to, whereas last time they voted on election day. Yeah, I think Harris needs to turn out, obviously, every college-educated woman she can, and then really go for some working-class women, especially if they're moved on the abortion issue, and then for younger voters. And, they're notoriously hard to turn out, but they're not impossible. So, yeah, I think it's a long way of saying, actually what you say makes sense to me. I have a slight resistance to the ground game thing just because I've been in too many campaigns where people were behind. This happened to Bush in 92 a little bit. And, well, we have the ground games. You have the governor and the operation there, and they know what they're doing in these states. The Democrats haven't won these states in 12 years. That was the case at this point in 92, and they probably won the states anyway, So, but I do think in these very closely divided states, the ground game could matter. And I think even more important, as you said, the enthusiasm. But think about the enthusiasm. The enthusiasm has to be negative enthusiasm. It's very nice, Harris. People like her. They want her to be president. People were not sitting around 6 months ago though, or 2 years ago, saying, you know what, Kamala Harris, it wasn't like Clinton or Obama or anything like that, right? So it's got to be, we need to vote to stop Trump from being president.
I think that's what I'm talking about. And I think that's where the energy comes. I think it's on abortion, and I think it's on stopping Trump. And I think it's more energy than the right has on their side. That's what I think. Sure, there are people on the right that are saying this is the most important election ever. And they certainly have an enthusiastic base, people who go to rallies and everything. But the coalition is broader on our side. And I think it's actually more motivated. That's just that more of us are motivated than them. I could be deluding myself, and I think that, at this point, I have to hang on to some hope. But
no, absolutely.
But I do think that that the data that we have now that we didn't have in 1992, right, allows these campaigns to see where people are turning out and to quickly adapt to that in these final weeks, depending on early vote, that kind of thing. And then literally, I don't care if they have to throw them on buses. It'll happen. But I think that is just an advantage. It's an advantage. The anti-Trump energy, the abortion energy, plus the money that actually goes into the mechanics is an advantage that the Trump campaign doesn't have. And I hope it works. All right.
That sounds right. That sounds right. So from your lips to God's ears. But
we can't spend any more time with me talking myself off the ledge today. That's for another day, but we promise we'll come back with that. Bill, thank you for joining me. Everyone keep it here on the Bulwark's YouTube channel. We have so much coming all the time. Up until November 5, after November 5, we're never sleeping again. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.